Paul Levy is an artist and an author with a Jungian background and is also a practicing Buddhist. Paul is a pioneer in the field of spiritual emergence and one of the few living scholars on the subject of the shadow and human evil. Among other titles, he's the author of Dispelling Wetiko, Breaking the Curse of Evil, which is a subject we're going to be talking with him about today. His website is awakeninthedream.com. And thank you so much, Paul, for talking with us. We've both, Colin and I have both been really influenced by your work. It's what really propelled us to start this investigation, do this deep shadow work on ourselves, and go on the investigation of really understanding Wetiko and evil, and we're still on it. And just to be able to have this conversation after a couple years to really dig into this, we're just very thankful that you're doing this with us today.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you, because you remember we actually drove up to your place a few years ago, and we had lunch, and that's when this all started. And I want to also say about your work is that I've been looking at this subject for a long time, the subject of the shadow and evil and human destructiveness as well. And I also started, or one of the ways I really tried to get into this may have been how you also, I know you had a Jungian background, but you also started looking at psychopathy, and maybe you know this book, Political Ponerology.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that direction, but when I read Dispelling Wetiko, and I made some highlights in my Kindle version of it to prepare for this interview, and I go back through it because it's been a couple of years since I've looked at it closely. It reminds me of how I realize, reading your writings, that your writings about the subject of human evil are totally unique to me, because you go into this in really an artistic way. It's very poetic. Your writings are very poetic, and it really helps the reader to get a feeling for what this domain is. It's not just science or a scientific kind of view. I know that Jung also can evoke a feeling like this, but I feel like you describe it, you go around it, and you really try to just keep giving people more and more analogies that help you to really get a hold of this. And so I think it's totally unique, and there's nothing really like it out there. And this field is rather empty. There's very few living people in really studying human evil deeply. So I think people who are interested in this have to read your book for sure.
Definitely. And the other thing is that Wetiko now, because of your work, is really getting out into the collective consciousness. It's becoming a meme. I see it more and more and more. And that's another reason why we felt it's very, very important to really understand as much as we can and to map this out in the best way that we can, so that people can really understand what Wetiko is as far as what we know so far, because it starts to get distorted out there.
It gets mythologized, and it gets all new agey and all of this. So maybe we could just do that, and you could just give us give the viewers an introduction to Wetiko.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's my pleasure.
Okay,
and
great. Thank you.
So first off, it's an indigenous term.
Yeah.
And it connotes the spirit of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's pointing out. So what I've done is, in studying the indigenous traditions, and it's in every spiritual tradition. Being this modern person in the West, I've tried to translate it into a psychological idiom that really can be understandable to modern Western people. And so the first thing is that the origin of Wetiko is the psyche.
Right.
And it's funny because I've been accused of, my work is so out there and really just conspiratorial or whatever.
Uh,
And what I'm in essence saying is that the origin of what's playing out of the evil that's playing out in the world is the human psyche. I mean,
right.
that's in essence what this is about. And the thing about Wetiko, it operates through the unconscious and through the part of us. We all have this part of us that's blind, and it works through the blind spot in such a way that it plugs into the projective tendencies of the mind, because we're always projecting onto the inkblot of life, but it plugs into the projective tendencies of the mind so that we become entranced by our projections, thinking that they're objective, that they're separate from us, and then we react
Right.
to the projections as if they're objective. And of course, when we do that, and I go into this, and I can go into this in the interview too,
Mm-hmm.
the the very way things work is that when we hold a particular perspective
Mm-hmm.
in whether it's in a night dream or the waking dream, the way this universe works is that it will then shapeshift and reflect back all the evidence we need
Right.
to confirm whatever viewpoint we're holding in a way that we then we actually hypnotize ourselves. And that is one way of describing Wetiko.
Mm-hmm.
And there are all these other ways. I circumambulated in the book in as many ways as I can imagine.
Right.
One other way is that it's a form of being blind. It's like this psychic form of blindness, but it's a form of blindness that actually believes that it's seeing clearly, and it will then perceive that the people who are actually clear-sighted, that they're the ones who are blind.
Right.
And so one way of thinking about it, you can think about it almost like a cancer in the mind, or like this
A
sort
virus.
of this mind virus.
Right.
It's a psychic virus, and it's invisible. And as long as it's invisible, that's what gives its power. That's what gives it power. So the point is that one of the main ways, if not the main way, of healing this disease of the soul is to actually begin to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's what my whole work is about, and that's what I would love to talk more about during today's
Yeah.
interview.
Now that's beautiful. So now, what I would like to do now maybe is just ask you this question to really hone down on the subject itself of Wetiko, and ask you, how do you see your current understanding of Wetiko in relation to Jung's understanding of the shadow and the effects of the shadow personally and collectively?
Yeah. And no, that's such a great question,
Right.
and I'm glad at the end you differentiated. There's the personal dimension of the shadow, and then
Right.
there's the archetypal dimension of the
Right.
shadow. And the thing about Wetiko, it's both. It operates through the personal dimension, but it plugs in to the deeper archetypal dimension, whose origin is the collective unconscious.
Right.
And to answer that question, I guess if I can describe just the process
Mm-hmm.
from the psychological point of view of how Wetiko actually, how it operates.
Yeah.
So say if I, as an individual person, say if I'm not fully owning my shadow, well, then what do I do? Be it personal or archetypal. Of course, I'll split it off and I'll project it out.
Right.
And now just to really understand this, if we think when we're having at night, inside of a dream, if I'm splitting off from my own shadow in a dream from the darker part of me, well, then what's going to happen? That part that I've split off from is going to get projected out into the dream,
Right.
and then you can pretty much guarantee that some dream character or
Oh,
a
yeah.
group of people will then embody that split off part. And of course, if I don't have lucidity, I'm going to think, oh, it's separate from me and all that.
Right.
Well, that same process is at work in the waking dream. So to the extent that I'm, disassociating from my own darkness, from my own shadow, I'm going to project it out. And then in the waking dream, there'll be somebody who will be carrying it, whether it's an individual person or a nation or whatever group, any form of collectivity. And then they'll be embodying that shadow. Now, I'm not causing them, in this causal way.
Mm-hmm.
But when I project out the shadow, it's making it more probable that
Mm-hmm.
they then will act it out. And as soon as they then embody that shadow, then I have evidence to prove my point of view that the evil is outside of me,
Right.
because then they're embodying it. So of course, as soon as they embody it, that then confirms to me my viewpoint. Then I become even more entrenched in my point of view that the evil is outside of me. So then I even project out the shadow even more. And the more I do that, the more it will manifest outside of me in a self-perpetuating feedback loop. And of course, they're probably doing the same, to whether it's to me or whoever else. And of course, what I'm actually enacting on the world stage, whether it's in the form of just being in relationship with somebody or in the body politic, is the actual inner process of disassociating from my own shadow is actually getting enacted in a collective fashion in the world stage. So that's really important, because then it's what I'm saying is that my inner process is getting actually embodied through the outer world. And of course, then what I do is I try to destroy the shadow, because that's the
Right.
actual first impulse was to try to get rid of my own darkness. So then I try to destroy the person who's embodying that. And by doing that,
Right.
I've literally become possessed by the very evil that I projected out. And that's the psychological description of how Wetiko plays out in the world.
Right, but that's
Right.
also pretty much the exact psychological description of how Jung explains shadow projection.
Exactly. And shadow projection, he describes shadow projection. He says it is the lie. That's his
Yeah.
phrase. It's the lie. And who's the liar but Satan, the devil. So that's how it sort of symbolically ties into evil.
Right. Now, if I want to look at this really scientifically, so I'm going to be looking for the particle. I'm going to be looking for the devil particle. Where is this, right? I'm going to be going, where is this source? What is this thing? And so, I mean, maybe I could just say it right out right now, just kind of cut to the chase here and say that studying people's models, studying Jung's model of the shadow, studying your model, studying Eckhart Tolle's pain body as he describes it.
That's very similar to Wetiko.
Very
Right.
similar. Also, the work of Robert L. Moore, how he talks about he maps out what he believes are the four major archetypes of the psyche, and then he shows how each one can have a bipolar shadow manifestation. Or we've also looked at Lama Leone's work, and I'm looking at some people here. Colin Wilson's another guy who really deeply went into, right. And so there's a handful of people, and I'm looking at all of these, and I'm going, okay, trying to correlate all of this, and if someone were to say, okay, tie all that together, make sense out of all that, I would say something like, well, as we know, if you know from looking at Jung, what the shadow is that when you repress psychic material that your ego and persona cannot come to terms with, and that, let's say, your family and society cannot come to terms with, and you repress this ancient energy, or it could be the effects of trauma, it could be intergenerational trauma, it could be the effects of that, it could be ancient animal impulses, whatever it is, it's shadow material, it's deep in the unconscious, and that when you repress this, it becomes an energy source for what Jung would call complexes or autonomous complexes, neuroses, pathologies. It becomes a power source for split off psychic elements. And that those psychic elements, because these are energy systems, these are informational, the psyche is an energetic informational field, as you know. And then when you start to, this shadow material gives fuel to split off parts, and then you get basically in yourself, and then we collectively carry an ecosystem of destructive scripts that Eckhart Tolle would call the pain body. And then that pain body, just like our conversation and all of our language becomes culture, our shadow material becomes an underground, unseen informational culture, a Wetiko field that's all out there, shared between all of us, just like all our psychic material is shared, but this is the underground stuff, the parasitic stuff, and it's all out there, and it's exchanging between all of us. There's a whole shadow dimension of parasitic destructive relationships living throughout all of us, compelling all of us, then that's kind of a way, I just described it there, of kind of tying all of these things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that was beautiful. That makes total sense, because the thing about Wetiko, it's so trippy because it's an inner disease of the soul that explicates itself through the outside world in a synchronistic way. So somehow it's as if it's able to extend its influence into the outer world from the inner psyche in such a way that it will configure events in the outer world to actually express what's going on inside of our psyche.
Right.
And what you just described, Colin, it's very much like, it's something that, it's in the field. It non-locally pervades the field in potential at any given moment. And it's in any individual or all of us at any given moment in potential, but it can get actually, it can appear in a collective fashion through, like you were saying, through society, through culture, through whatever corporations or institutions that literally keep it in place. And then there becomes a consensus agreement about what's possible, what's not possible, that keeps us in this limited sphere. And the author of those limitations are the Wetiko bug.
Right. Now, isn't it also true, though, that just as the Wetiko gets mirrored out of the psyche into the collective field, and then we see it as true, and it becomes this feedback loop feeding itself, isn't that also true with all psychic material, all of our perception? Because you say it in this term, awaken in the dream. Isn't it also true that the Wetiko aspect of the psyche is one aspect that we're especially blind to, but we're generally blind to the fact how that all psychic material is mirroring, and there's this dreamlike activity going on, whether it's evil or whether it's otherwise. It's all psychic material is like that. Isn't that true?
Yeah, well, that's why, in my book I talk about, and they're actually interconnected, but there are three different, aspects or these ways of seeing Wetiko, and the first one is to see this being like a dream. That this is very much a dreamlike reality.
Yes.
And the thing I mean by that, first off, it's ever-changing, it's impermanent, it's not separate from our own consciousness. So what we're seeing out there is actually reflecting what's going on in here, and that's an exact, precise description of a dream. The other two, which are really interrelated, so to see the dreamlike nature, to have the recognition of the non-local field that is informing all of the 3D, how this world manifests. So this world is in a way enfolded within, this, you could call it the implicate order or the non-local field. So to actually, instead of being entranced by the superficial appearances of this world, you actually begin to see the context, which is informing and containing all of the content. And the third thing is to see, we're actually not separate. Being like a dream, we're dream characters. So you guys are dream characters of mine, which means you're these reflections, these embodied reflections of parts of me, but I'm also a dream character of yours. And that means we're interconnected, interdependent, which means that we're not separate. So those things, the dreamlike nature, the non-local field, and seeing through the separation, all of those are in the service of actually seeing through Wetiko.
Right, and I know for us, and we call the same thing, it came to us as living in a movie.
Living in the movie.
Living in the movie. And
it's a thing, right.
It's exactly the same thing.
Right.
But what I find interesting is that it takes you're a shaman.
I mean, really, that is
you are a shaman.
Yeah.
You have gone through the shamanic experience through your everything that you've experienced in your life. You were able to actually use your darkness, use the Wetiko as a way of your own personal evolution. And that's what we have done too. And that's why we were able to actually have the experience of awakening in the dream. I think it's really important that people understand that the only way to have this realization, and it's a deep realization that you're awakened in a dream or that you're living in a movie, is to actually have the courage to be willing to go into your darkness, go into, understand your own personal darkness, and use it as a tool for your evolution.
But before you respond to that, I just want to say one thing, though. It is also true, though, to both of you guys, that just like in Paul's life example, you can have a peak experience that is outside of doing, say, shadow work, that just comes on and gives you this giant realization of the dreamlike nature of reality. But you do return eventually back to this dimension. But you remember from Jung's work and from all the material that we know about alchemy and the art that the alchemists created, that the first step in the alchemical process, in the individuation process, is the negrito. It is confronting your darkness, and there is a reason. Because we believe that, I mean, I'm sure you believe this too, that alchemy is the archetypal formula for evolution, and it's in nature itself. Plants go through this, the seasons go through this, everything goes through this, and it starts with a winter, and so it's like, it is the case that when you may not ask to have a dark night of the soul, you usually fall into it. But when you do fall into it, if you have enough separation to be able to say, this means something important and I had better use this opportunity to evolve. And when you do that, and you start to go in the mining process for the Philosopher's Stone, for your alchemical gold, that triggers something in the psyche that says, this individual is turning on the evolutionary process, let's go. And then you start to get this gnosis. Isn't that true?
Yeah, well, no, it's definitely true. And what you're saying, what the two of you are saying, it reminds me when somebody, gets a calling, to whatever, to step out of their ego, or to maybe become a healer or a shaman or whatever, it's not something that you consciously decide to do as an ego. It's something that the spirits, they say, send you. And if you don't cooperate with that calling and say, okay, I will follow you, that's the point where the would-be healer or shaman can get really sick and can even die.
Right.
But then when you actually say, okay, I'm signing on to this, I'm going to agree to follow my calling, then the same powers that sponsor the calling will then sponsor, all of whatever the help or the allies that you'll need to fulfill your calling. And so, and then, the thing that I'm describing, that's the archetypal journey of, anybody of the on the path of individuation, or the alchemist, or the shaman, or healer, or the whatever you would call it, practitioner, bodhisattva. One other piece that I wanted to bring out is that the thing about Wetiko, which is so amazing, it's like this. Because I just wrote a book.
Tell us about that, actually.
On quantum physics and dreaming, and I talk about Wetiko in the book, because quantum physics is basically, they've discovered that this is a dream, but a lot of the physicists don't realize what the deeper implications of their theory is. Yeah. So I felt compelled to write this book to maybe point that out. But the point is that Wetiko, it's a quantum phenomena, and what I mean by that, similar like, well, what is, if you see light, what is the nature of light? Is it a wave or a particle? Well, it's both in potential. It depends how it's observed. Same thing with Wetiko. It's like superposition of states in which the deepest, darkest, the archetypal evil that's informing all of humanity, acting out, that's the source of that is Wetiko. And it contains not only its own healing and medicine, but it actually contains a blessing in that Wetiko is actually helping us to wake up. And how it will manifest, either as that toxin, that poison, or that blessing, it's all a function of if we have the recognition of what it's revealing to us.
Exactly.
That what you're just talking about there is when I was doing when we were getting ready to write this book, Shadow Tech, and I thought, I've got to dig. Before I start going in talking about the shadow of the psyche and human darkness, I've got to go dig down further in a scientific way and look at darkness or the destructive force in the universe in a more metaphysical or maybe scientific way. And so, the first thing that comes one of the first things is, this scientific understanding of entropy, right? And but the first chapter of our book goes into this, and I won't go into it now. But what we discover is that it's really embodied in that Taoist symbol, the yin yang symbol. And you could look at the black and the white as the masculine and feminine or active and passive modes of life. But you could also look at it as the creative and the destructive process in the universe. And you see how they're giving rise to each other. The two fishes are of equal size, and they're giving rise to each other. And the fact of the matter is that when you really try to objectively look at evil or destruction, and you get out of the human subjective experience and go, well, is there evil in nature? Like you might know Lyle Watson's book, Dark Nature. He's a biologist. Is there
Right.
evil or something of equivalence in these other systems? And you find that there is. And you realize that my body is 13.8 billion years of stacked technology and experience and success of evolution. And how do you get that kind of integrity in life? How do you get that kind of integrity, just so much integrity? Well, you've got to put some kind of equal and opposite pressure on evolution. You've got to have some kind of ultimately destructive force in the universe, which will ensure that only the only systems of the highest integrity make it through, right? And it's kind of the way I see the dark side of the universe.
Yeah, well, what you're saying, what it brings up in me is like, the thing about Wetiko, it really forces us to come to terms with not only our own darkness, but also being a creative person. And in creativity, in the creative spirit, there's an incredible fine line between constructive, being creative in a constructive way and being self or other, sort of this destructive energy.
Yes.
That destructive and constructive energy are like side by side.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why so many artists, they self-destruct at a certain point because they're navigating that edge.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the point is that one of the main ways of dealing, because we all potentially are infected with Wetiko. If we say, that person has Wetiko out there and we don't, well, that point of view is itself an expression that we've fallen under its thrall because it feeds off of polarization. So the idea being, that we all have in potential, but being creatively expressing ourselves in whatever medium. And I'm not just talking painting or drawing, or that's very flatland. I mean, all that's great, but I'm talking about this universe is the canvas, and we're dreamers and artists, and our canvas is life itself. And to the extent that we can express ourselves creatively, that in a way that really is healing, at the same time, the Wetiko in us, and in a non-local way, the Wetiko throughout the whole field.
Yeah, it seems like what happens is that if there are repressed areas of trauma or intergenerational trauma in the unconscious, in the psyche, that is not being utilized in a creative way, or even if it is, if there are places that are being repressed, it becomes this food source for Wetiko. And it will actually become stronger, it becomes bigger, and then if you don't recognize it, if you don't have the proper tools, for us it was doing emotional processing, but you really have to work on the actual trauma or the deeper places that are energies that are being repressed in the psyche, and actually transmute that on every level, on physical, emotional, and
totally.
Psychic. Because if you don't constantly do that work, and being an artist, I've been noticing, we're musicians, and there's been a lot of musicians who have been killing themselves lately.
Right.
You know, and it's very sad. And the latest one, Chester Bennington of this band Linkin Park, who just hung himself the day before yesterday, he spent his whole career, he was molested as a child for about 5 years. But he didn't hide it. He was putting that directly into his music, into his lyrics, into his performance. He inspired a lot of young people.
Used that to displace the energy.
He used it to displace the energy, and yet he was still able to be taken over by the Wetiko to such an extent that he hung himself. And this I do see this happen. And
let him talk about that. How it can, a complex, however you want to describe it, can become so autonomous, so powerful that you will have a moment and it will take you over. And you know this, yes.
Yeah. So actually, no, I'm so familiar with it.
Yes, I know.
I appreciate it because not everybody is switched on to this.
Right.
So there's a couple things I want to say. First about having to deal, like you were saying, about the trauma. And that's 100% true. And I want to point out the thing about Wetiko, it's a form, or it is trauma, in the sense that our species, we're having collective PTSD. The human species is suffering from a form of collective trauma. But what is trauma? Something will happen historically one moment in time, and then it's gone. But we internalize it, and when we become a victim of trauma, the way we try to heal from the trauma, in a weird way, actually creates the very trauma we're trying to heal from in a way that's crazy making. And that's the infinitely self-perpetuating feedback loop. And that's Wetiko. So I just wanted to point out that not only does it demand that we deal with our trauma, but it is trauma on the one hand. Now, what I wanted to say about the autonomous complexes, Colin, I'm so glad you brought that up, because the thing about Wetiko, you see, it's incredibly, or it can be really hard to see it, but when you see it, then it's not like you don't see it from that point on. Right. And the thing about Wetiko, it's a bug. You can think of it like this bug that's a shape-shifting bug. And what it'll do, it will assume your form. So it will impersonate you. Yeah. And then if you're not awake in that moment, you identify with its version of who you are. And all the while you're thinking, you're acting out your own impulses or your own beliefs or thoughts, while in what's happening is that you're unwittingly being an instrument for the Wetiko virus to actually act itself out through you. So what's happened is you become the conduit for this higher dimensional virus to act itself out and to give itself form in the third dimension. And the thing is just from the psychological point of view, when we have trauma and what happens in trauma, we split off from a part of it. And we all, like I'm saying, we've all had wounds or abuse or trauma. Yes. And then what happens if we don't develop, some form of dialogue, relationship, or integrate that trauma, it becomes so dissociated from the wholeness of our psyche that it will develop this seeming almost like a will or this life of its own, at least apparently, to the point where, the phrase, it becomes an autonomous complex. Now, the indigenous people, that's what they call a demon.
Right. Thank you.
Autonomous complexes are demons. And the thing about Wetiko is that if you think about it, almost like when you have like this tapeworm in your body, the tapeworm will secrete chemicals that you will all of a sudden desire food that feeds it. And all the while eating, and you're thinking you're nourishing yourself, but the parasite, the Wetiko, the tapeworm, it's growing bigger and bigger, and you're just the host until it eventually kills you. But it doesn't want to kill you too soon, because if it does, then it has to suffer the inconvenience of finding a new host.
Which is really interesting. Quickly, a story, because we were talking about this morning. So next door to us, this was a couple years ago, maybe even, no, it was, I think, before we went to visit you, but we were sitting here having a conversation, and this guy next door was very injured mentally. He was in a wheelchair. He was going...
And he was having a whole breakdown, a whole episode, which was way beyond his ability to deal with.
But we didn't know this at the time, and we were having this very deep discussion, and all of a sudden, I felt like I was being... Something wanted to come into me.
Right.
And then we find out the next day that was the moment he was dying over there.
Oh, wow. Right.
He died.
Yes.
And so there was something, some destructive energy, and I felt it. It wanted to come, and Colin was there, and he said he had to pull me out. There was something there.
We were sort of in a mode where we were so like actively pursuing our complexes. And that they were starting to move, and we were starting to have episodes of all kinds, and chronic pain, and all kinds of junk was going on when we were in this mode.
Right.
And so I wasn't unfamiliar with Melissa having some kind of an episode, but this one was kind of weird, and she was just like, I don't feel good, and she got down into a ball in the ground and started.
I felt literally like my own psyche was leaving, and that there was something else that was trying to come.
And I went and got a drum and started playing a drum to try to bring her back, and it was bizarre. And it was like, what just happened? And then we found out later that this very traumatized young man who had this terribly aggressive viral energy just passed away at that moment. And so this starts to bring it into actual science and actual field theory and stuff, and you start to go, whoa, this isn't actually, we may get to the point to where we can actually see this field like we can now see molecules and atoms with certain technology.
I mean maybe with your studies of quantum physics, I mean, maybe there's a way that you can describe this that is, because it's...
Well, yeah, no, if I can say, there are a couple of things, because I mean, I so appreciate your experience, Melissa, because the thing about Wetiko, it's like, sort of like this vampiric figure, in the sense that it's not independent. If it doesn't have somebody to feed off of, it goes out of business, it dies.
Yeah.
And so just, clearly you're very sensitive, and then this energy was getting expelled from its host because he was dying.
Right.
And you were just sensitive and open enough, and thankfully, because I actually had to go through that in my own family, that exact experience. I mean, it was different iteration of it.
Yes.
But I know that one so well, and so that I just really appreciate you saying that. But the thing I want to say about, there's an edge I have, because I know there are some people in the field who they're switched on to Wetiko, and they say, oh, we've found it and we know what it looks like. And I want to point out, oh, well, they've just, by holding that viewpoint, they've fallen under the spell.
Yeah.
Because it's exactly like if you hold up an object and there's the silver surface of like this, whatever, like a mirror, and you see the reflection of the object in the mirror. And so that reflection is inseparable from the mirror. There's not two separate things there, but you have to have the realization that reflection is not the object that it's reflecting.
Right.
In the same way, one can see a particular specific, manifestation of Wetiko, and if you think, oh, that's it, that's Wetiko, you've fallen under the spell, because you don't realize, no, that's just a reflection on a lower level of reality of a higher dimensional, sort of a higher dimension that's actually projecting itself into the lower dimension, and you don't want to concretize that as being Wetiko. No, that's just one of its appearances.
Yeah, don't concretize it. Don't confuse the map with the territory. You put on a lens that allowed you to see something that was invisible before, but you're using, you have rationalized and built a model for yourself that allows you to see something you couldn't see before, but realize it is a rationalization, it is a model, it is insufficient to describe it in its entirety. But I also just want to step back one more and go back to the vampiric nature of this, because and you describe how the rabies virus works in your book,
in my book,
and all over the place. And so we started looking at in biology, just the understanding of this relationship profile of parasitism. And what is parasitism in biology, and how does it work? And it's exactly what you said. So you have an organism. We use the example of this little microscopic organism that gets into cats and rats, and it manipulates them, and it's able to get into a rat's brain and change the neuronal structure in the cells in a part of the brain so that the rat cannot smell cat urine anymore. And so then the rat will go around where cats hang out. It'll ultimately get eaten. It'll find the microscopic parasite will find itself back into a cat's gut. That's where it needs to breed, inside a cat's gut. And then the cat will poop out some more of these. So this little organism is so intelligent for what it is, that it has figured out a way to manipulate these greater, much more intelligent organisms. And this is half of the biosphere is at least partially parasitic. It's totally ubiquitous. So to think that there's so much, the viruses are the most populous organism on the planet. So why wouldn't you have a function of your own psyche, a split-off function of your own psyche that acts parasitically when it's so common in nature?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And that's why, one of the things that I talk about in the book, so many people who are interested in, whatever, enlightenment or spirituality, they talk about, we need to see the light and be in the light, and we don't want to put our attention on the dark because that'll feed the dark and all that. And I point out, and not just me, there are a number of people who point out, well, the thing about light, it's meaningless unless it actually sheds light on the darkness, unless it helps you see in the dark. And so the point is to really shed light on these darker parts of the psyche in us, because by seeing that, and that's why Wetiko, like a vampire can't stand the light of day, right? That's in mythology, and that's symbolizing exactly this process, that when you begin to bring awareness to how Wetiko works, you take away its power, and it doesn't have any autonomy anymore, and you're empowering yourself. So the point is this, the implication is that as we get closer to shedding the light of consciousness on the Wetiko in us and in the field, and just seeing how it works in a non-local way, it will act itself out and get even more seemingly evil or dark. And it's easy to interpret that like, things are getting worse, I'm really screwed up, or I'm on the wrong path, and then stop your inquiry. And then Wetiko has tricked you. But the point is, if you can interpret that manifestation, that of the darkness even getting worse. If you think about it, when shadows are getting darker and deeper, that's a sign that the light is getting closer. So the idea is, instead of interpreting it like, that's a bad thing, the fact that the evil seems to be getting more intense. Just if you think about what's happening in the body politic right now, that if you can understand, that's an expression that there's like a deeper, higher dimensional light that's getting closer and closer, then it's not going to stop you from continuing your inquiry.
It's not going to stop you, but Paul, the thing is, of course you realize this, and that one of the biggest blockages to this is that we don't have enough models, we don't have enough analogies, and so that's why the kind of work that we're all doing is great. But what it really comes down to, as you know, is an immense amount of self-responsibility that most people may not be ready for.
Right. That's what I was going to bring up too, that in order to really start to be able to see this is to really take personal responsibility for your own internal state and your own internal darkness, and that's very challenging for some.
Right, and that, in the quantum physics book, that's one of the main sort of implications of quantum physics is that they've discovered, there's no objective world. The act of observing the universe is invoking the very universe you're observing. But what they're pointing out is that our experience, our moment-by-moment experience of the world and of ourselves, we're actually creating that. Now, I want you to notice, I didn't say we're creating like the outside world. I'm saying we're creating our experience of being in the world, and because it's important to be careful with like how we articulate stuff, because with words we use we're casting spells, and so I don't want to, if any physicists out there are listening, I don't want them to have this reaction about he's inflated, thinking he's God and he's creating the universe. No, but I'm creating my moment-by-moment experience of the universe, and I'm creating my moment-by-moment experience of myself
Yes.
And that's an enormous responsibility. And that cuts through two things. That cuts through being the victim, and it also cuts through, we were talking before about projecting the shadow. All of a sudden, wait a second, the evil we're seeing out there, if this is a dream, which means we're looking in a mirror, that evil we're seeing out there is coextensive and reflecting some sort of darker part of myself. So the thing about Wetiko, you see, it distracts us by making us put our attention outside of ourselves, thinking, oh, the problem is if only this legislation would happen, or this politician would win, or we did that, or whatever. Well, yeah, that might be helpful on a superficial level, but the source of all of evil that's playing out is to be found inside of the psyche. And that's what my whole work is about.
Right.
Yeah, no, you can be very even, even if someone doesn't want to go so far as to accept at first that our outer reality appears as a dream, and I think anyone who really goes into this, who has a some kind of a experience or intelligence in regards to symbolism and all of that, will start to find that this is true. But we know, I mean, that we are only, that the ego state is really only conscious of, let's say, 5% of our cognition. So, and we also know that everything that we know or perceive, and you mentioned this a lot, is not the outside world, but some kind of a makeshift model of that outside world. We are acting and reacting and responding to a model, not to the outside world. And so when you start to talk about how that the outside world is, or that when you start to talk about the projected nature of reality, you're basically talking about the way in which just the psyche works and stuff. We don't know what the outside world is. We're all living in a personal and collective modeling system that you could call a dream. And that is just, I mean, take the dream part out of it, that's a kind of an artistic way of looking at it, and just call it an operating system or whatever, and we're all running the same codes. So a lot of the operating system has been passed to us genetically because it was developed by our ancestors, and some of it is in the current culture and we're using it. We're all living in a synthetic, informational, constructed reality in order to model whatever objective reality is. We don't know what that is.
What you're saying, Colin, I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about in the quantum physics book. One of the metaphors that quantum physicists will use was, the cave with,
Plato's
cave, where, like, one of the big discoveries of quantum physics is they've realized, they're not really studying whatever, reality is. They're actually, so they're studying just the shadows on the wall of the cave.
Right.
And what I'm pointing at is that they're beginning to have the recognition, they're turning their attention, I wonder what's casting the shadow, which is the light of consciousness.
Right.
Because they've discovered that, you can't, that the study of the physical world, of whatever, just like the actual, physical matter, that's inseparable from the study of consciousness, and that they're not two separate entities that are encountering each other, but they're actually inseparable. And that's very much, when you think about a dream, when you're in a dream, you'll be experiencing this universe and it'll appear really real and solid, exactly like right now, right? And yet, if you have lucidity in that night dream, what you discover is that, what I thought the moment before was objective and real and solid, it's actually inseparable from my psyche, that I'm actually inside of my psyche. When I'm in the dream and have lucidity, I'm walking around inside of my psyche. And that's the realization that I'm talking about. It's very much like being in a night dream, but the night dream is the waking dream, is this collectively shared dream. And that same realization of recognizing the nature of our situation, that the physical world is actually an inseparable expression of our consciousness, i.e. that we're actually inside of our psyche. That's the point of view. And it's not hard to have for a moment, just like in a night dream.
Right.
People have I'll have moments of that, but then it's so easy just to fall back to sleep, to forget, to get absorbed back into the forms of the dream. So my understanding of what people who are doing real spiritual practice is that you're more and more integrating and stabilizing and strengthening that realization to the point where that becomes really your whole viewpoint of how you interpret and integrate moment by moment, like your experiences every day.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Yeah, completely. That's how we live our lives now.
And you always fall back. You always fall back into the
little
separation of thinking that, oh, that person really did do something to me. There really is an evil president out there. And it's not that there isn't a president out there, but my perception of him, and I was going to ask you to maybe talk on this, is that how can you talk about the practice of using a trigger, something that negatively charges you, this president or this policy or this neighbor of mine or family member, as a way of seeing your own shadow material, which is resonating with that outside person?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because the egoic response when somebody, whether it's our president or whoever, doesn't have to be, can be anybody, when something seemingly out in the outside world triggers us, what the ordinary reaction is to put our attention that the problem is out there. Right. If only they wouldn't do that, if only it would be a different president, then I would be at peace, then I wouldn't, But the point is what if, in that moment of being triggered by whatever the external event is, what if we have the realization in that moment that, what if we turn our awareness, instead of putting it outside of ourselves, what if we turn it on ourselves and take a look at what inside of us is getting triggered? That's an incredible opportunity. Something that was like in the unconscious is now all of a sudden potentially able to be seen. And then if we do that, that's where all of a sudden we can integrate part of our unconscious, part of our shadow. And then by doing that, not only are we serving our own wholeness, but any one of us doing that is actually, in a non-local way, helping the whole field.
Oh man, and the thing is I questioned for a long time is how much could my shadow integration work really affect the field? But the more deeper I get into this, the more I realize that the more material I integrate inside of myself, the more it changes my entire state. It changes my demeanor. It changes all my cycles. It changes my posture. It changes my whole view of the world and of other people. I become another person, and this is long-term, lifelong work, of course. But hey, what if 1,000 people of influence in the world really did this work?
Can I just point out there's two things? On the one hand, there's a beautiful image. Jung points out, it's a really favorite image of his. He goes, when you have sugar and you just put these granules of sugar in a glass of water, it'll just dissolve and dissolve and dissolve until it gets to the saturation point. Yeah. And then you add one more granule of sugar and a crystal will manifest.
That's true.
He makes the point. He goes, any one of us, either seeing Wetiko or owning our shadow or whatever you would call it, that might be that granule of sugar that precipitates a change in the entire collective unconscious. And that's a very inspiring thought form, So then the other thing I wanted to say, Colin, of what you just brought up, this beautiful way of understanding what you were saying, is just, through imagination. Imagine we're in a dream at night, and imagine that your dream ego in that dream, the figure that you're identified with, that you have the realization that, this is a dream, you have lucidity, you're dreaming, and say there are other figures in the dream, and then if it's not just you, but then say one other figure, one other of your dream characters, an aspect of yourself, they also have lucidity, and then imagine 10 others have lucidity, and then imagine 100 others have lucidity, and then imagine you come together and you contemplate what you're understanding, what you're realizing, i.e., oh my God, we're in a dream, and this dream is manifesting the way it is because we're dreaming it that way. It's what I call the sacred power of dreaming. It's the part of us that's dreaming this universe into materialization. Well, the idea is, going back to that imagination in the dream, when a sufficient number of people in that dream actually have lucidity, they realize they can put their sacred power of dreaming together in a way to change the dream. Yeah, so that what I just described that's not just in the night dream, but that's our situation in the waking dream. That when a sufficient number of us, and this is what I think in the apocryphal text in the Bible, they'll talk about the 144,000, which is a symbolic number. Or then you can think about the 100th monkey phenomena.
Uh-huh.
It's pointing to the same thing. When a sufficient number of people in the waking dream have the realization, whether it's of seeing Wetiko or owning their shadow or recognizing this as a dream, when a sufficient number of people have that realization and connect with each other, what we discover is that, oh my God, we can actually change the dream. And that is evolution in action. And that's what this is all about. And that's what my whole work is about, really.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe Paul, we could sort of tail off now, and we could one of the last things that I have on my notes is and maybe this is one of the more difficult parts, is talking about healing modalities that actually work. And I could just bring up something, and then you could comment and tell us what your experience is. And
sure.
that is that one of the things we came into is that first we started to own this destructive material and try to map it and go through our past and create a story out of what has happened, and even link our story to the collective story and go through all of this kind of map making and mythologizing process. But then we found someone turned us on to this book and practice by a guy named John Ruskin, Ruskan, called Emotional Clearing. And what John Ruskin describes is a way of, in meditation, of when destructive feelings, a lot of it's feelings, whether it's fear, grief, guilt, anger, things like this, manifest themselves as a way to allow them up. And now what we did, though, is rather than just hoping that these might come up in a meditation, is every time we're triggered, whether it's an argument between us or whether it's a trigger over something else in the world, one of our complexes is active and we get triggered, at the height of the trigger, go sit down and basically give yourself permission for, rather than distracting away, rather than blaming, rather than pointing to the movie screen,
or repressing
it further through distraction or whatever, you basically say to yourself, okay, let's have it all. And what I noticed with myself is that I would normally be triggered with anxiety or an anger type of energy, but then right below that was a crap load of grief. And so I would start to accept this energy up, and it would start making me cry. And then for probably, I think I thought it was about 2.5 years, probably a couple times a month or something, I was able to access this material, and I cried so much. I cried. There were some occasions where I cried for 2 hours. And you just don't let yourself stop. You just keep going until there's no more there. And sometimes I had shifts in consciousness. Sometimes I had heart chakra awakenings. Sometimes I had a feeling of total lightness. Sometimes chronic pains went away. But that was more just like a taste of it. What really happened was, out of doing this, and Melissa did the same process, out of doing this for that time, I just cleared away a whole bunch of garbage. And I'm not as triggered anymore. I'm not as, I could go into all of the ways that I'm lighter and healthier. And when I think about all of the Jungian practices or alchemical or Buddhist or whatever practices that I've become aware of for moving destructive energy, for working on yourself in this way, this method is incredible. And so,
and we still use it, but the material is not as strong. It's much, but any time that we're triggered, we just actually recognize the trigger immediately, and then we sit in whatever the emotion that comes up and allow that full emotion to go through our body. And then it just releases itself, and it actually integrates more of your shadow. It's really been amazing.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. It sounds beautiful. I mean, because it's really important. I'm not at all attached to any
Yeah,
particular
Right,
I'm
yeah.
not either.
tradition, or whether it's, I do Tibetan Buddhist practice,
Right.
but
Yeah.
really into shamanism or alchemy or Jung or art
Right.
or dreaming. It doesn't make a difference. Just anything that works
Yeah.
for anybody, that's what's important. And but just getting in touch with the deeper, because I think we all hold our traumas or unprocessed stuff in our bodies,
Yeah.
and to be able to like access that and to creatively express it, whether it's in crying or in whatever way. I notice for me, when my like the trauma that I've been through, when it comes up, it almost comes up with a corresponding force field that wants me to look away, because it can feel at that moment really painful. And as it's almost like I'm going to the gym and you get bigger muscles, I've developed a psychic muscle to, in the moment when my trauma or the wound or the part of me that I would look away from comes up, I've managed to not dissociate and look away, but to actually just infuse it with present awareness. And then it softens or it self-liberates.
Right.
It dissolves back into the emptiness out of which it arose. And because for me, I think one thing that's like been the profound, really profound healing is to not so much identify with the content of the mind, with the stories.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's important on one level, but to really more to connect with the context in which all the content is displaying. And the context is really the true nature. It's very much like space. And, as I more and more become familiar with that part of my being, that part is already healed. That part is already,
Right.
and I don't need to transform or do anything. I just need to just kind of be in that and not get distracted from that. And that seems to be, from my experience, what really helps me.
But so you would agree though that when this destructive content comes up, it's always cyclically too, and when it comes up, that in whatever way you're capable, the idea is you have to embrace it, basically, right?
Oh, totally. No,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
You have
Because
to
it
embrace it.
feeds off of, I mean, if you remember what I said about Wetiko, it feeds off of polarization. And the essence of Wetiko, the essence of real archetypal evil is our clinging and our grasping. And it's onto whether you call it an objective world, or as soon as you like think the world objectively exists, you've reciprocally created a subject separate from the world.
Yeah.
And they're both aspects of the clinging. And then you cling to yourself as a reference point, as an ego that is an illusion. It doesn't even exist. And then you invest all of your energy in protecting and defending this separate self that doesn't even exist. And that's a way of actually describing Wetiko. So the deepest, like, fundamental process in forming Wetiko is that self-clinging. And this is actually what the Buddha discovered when he realized he was like a physician who discovered a cure for an illness, and the illness was suffering. That the root cause of suffering is that deep-seated, it's a chronic clinging that we have, and all of our like creative, psychic, the whole like this life force gets invested into that clinging and grasping, and we're clinging onto something that can never be caught. So it's a form of madness. That's the trauma, and that's Wetiko. That's just another way of describing Wetiko.
Just one last thing for clarity here for the viewers is that so in very practical terms, are you saying that you find yourself triggered, you find yourself experiencing something destructive, and let's say you believe it came from your spouse, and you're seeing it coming from another person. Let's say it's another person, it's the president out there that did this, or it's my spouse or lover that did this, etc., and you find yourself extremely hurt in one way or another, and then you go sit down to come to terms with this material, and then would you say that the meditation here is to try to hold the meditation and an awareness of the integration between my outside world and the seeming enemy out there and my own inner state, and try to hold this state of this is all connected, this is all one field, how I'm reacting is totally this is all a co-creative process, and I have to own this field, and so I'm going to stay in this because it's not really a separate other out there.
And that's what you're describing is quantum physics. Because quantum physics really, it's pointing at that this universe is whole. There's no separate parts. There's not like the observer interacting with the observed. Just like you were saying, say your spouse is playing something out and you're getting triggered. Well, that's a quantum system. There's no separate parts. And from the ultimate point of view, it's all part of one non-local field, and it's not divisible. And so the point is that Wetiko gets fed by putting our attention out there. Oh, the problem is out there, like we were saying before. But if you're triggered and if you're having some sort of reaction, wow, that's like coextensive with what's playing out there. That's not separate, and that's a way in where you actually can change something. In other words, yourself.
And ultimately, then, if it's all just one field, what's really happening is by me owning my own material, by me integrating this material, by me waking up to my own dark side and to the collective darkness and this whole process we're talking about here, what I really am a cell in the one being that's waking up. It's the one being that's waking up through me, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
No, that's it. Yep.
And I was going to just mention about how what you were talking about the Buddha and how he realized the space beyond the suffering, and that's been also my experience, is that the more I accept the darkness, accept those feelings, accept it, it creates this heart space, this compassion,
exactly the
to
compassion
grow.
Thing, right? Exactly.
Let's go there.
Yeah, and the thing, and then we should probably end.
Yeah,
but
perfect.
I'm going to have to go. But the idea of the compassion, in Buddhism, they'll say when you have the real awakening, it's always the co-joining of two factors of what's called having the recognition of the emptiness, and then compassion. And emptiness, what is emptiness? That, think about it, you're in a dream and you there's a universe that you think is real and solid and separate, and then you have lucidity and you recognize, oh, the forms of the dream, the entire dream, the whole cosmos in that dreamscape is empty. It doesn't exist from its own side. It's not independent. It doesn't have an intrinsic existence separate from your own consciousness. That's the emptiness. But they say if you just recognize the emptiness and there's not compassion, it's not the true awakening. So the point is, if you have the real, this realization of emptiness, at the same time, that realization will express itself energetically through compassion. So that's the joining of the emptiness and compassion. And so when people ask me, oh, can you give me how can I, see the dreamlike nature? And there are all these ways, that's a whole other discussion. But one simple way and powerful way is just cultivate your open heart, your compassionate heart. As you more and more connect with your true nature, which is compassion, that will help you to see the dreamlike nature.
Yeah, I think it's very important that people, that from my own experience, that true compassion is accepting the entirety of the experience, which includes Wetiko, includes the shadow. It's a deep, deep acceptance of all that is.
The part of you that doesn't include that, the part of you that's contracted doesn't embrace, it includes that too.
Exactly.
So it's truly all embracing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there anything before we go, Paul? Is there anything you wanted to talk about your new book, or just present that, or anything else that you want to say?
Not really. This feels really complete.
Okay.
So I've just written a book on quantum physics and consciousness. And pointing out that quantum physics is pointing out that this is a dream. And that's unequivocal. It's couldn't be more clear, and that'll be out probably sometime in 2018.
Okay.
Probably in a year.
Okay.
And no, I just so appreciate having this dialogue with other people who I don't have to translate for, or are very fluent, because some people will interview me and I'll be try to explain, and you get the sense they don't quite understand, and then you become, you kind of, at least for me, it affects the way I can verbalize stuff. So I'm just really appreciating that you're really fluent and fluid in this stuff we're speaking. So I really want to thank you and appreciate you guys. So
thank you also, Paul. And we really wanted to not only just compare notes and clarify things for ourselves, but to do exactly that is to have have an interview out there that folks that are going deeper into this realm can have, that's maybe taking it to the next level.
Yeah. Oh, and one final thing I
Yeah.
just thought of that might be helpful for some people who are seeing this is that how I really kind of discovered Wetiko, it was through my own trauma. There was like my father, without going into the
Right.
story, he was
Right.
just a real, a sick, very, in the psyche, very sick man, and acted out his abuse, and I was the recipient, and it created just enormous suffering and a wound and trauma, in me. And the way I dealt with it was to go inwards, was to really, go in my mind and really to bear witness, to try to understand what was happening. And that was really, how I, really first discovered Wetiko in my own life. And then I realized, oh my God, what's playing out in my family? It was an iteration of exactly what was playing out in the greater collective body politic. So I guess that would be a great closing thing to share, that for any of us, we all have our particular instantiations of our wounding or trauma, whether it's with our family of origin or whatever it is. And that, could be the thing that really screws us up and is something that was like a curse, or it could be a blessing in disguise. It could be the doorway into really connecting with this deeper part of who we are, and how it manifests is up to us. That's that responsibility that you guys were mentioning before. Yes, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. So everybody can find you at awakeninthedream.com, and
Right.
and we'll be in touch and do something again in the future.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. I'm just so happy, because the point is that as we more connect with other people who are also getting turned on to this stuff, that's really helpful.
And please send us anybody that you see that's coming into this field that you like. Please send that over to us. And we saw you on Sean Stone, and so that's great. And let's just keep doing it.
Sounds great.
All
Okay,
right.
guys.
Have a great day, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thanks
We'll
so
talk soon.
much.
Bye-bye. Okay,
Bye.
totally.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.